Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Nemanja Jurisic, and you are watching another NT podcast, which stands for Science and Theology, a shortcut that makes sense in Serbian language, at least. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Dale Allison. Welcome. How are you?
I'm great today. How are you?
Awesome. Oh, thanks for asking. I'm doing well. Excited to have you here today. And for those who don't know, Dr. Allison is a renowned New Testament scholar and professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. Dr. Allison is known for his extensive research on the historical Jesus and his thought-provoking insights on the New Testament. Today, we are diving into one of the most profounding questions in Christian history. Did Jesus rise from the dead? So, Dr. Allison, let's start with some basic facts at the beginning. Did Jesus Christ even die by crucifixion? If so, what arguments would you offer in support of that position?
So I think that's an easy question to answer. So I would simply say all the evidence points in that direction, and there is no evidence that contradicts it. The truth is that I don't know of anyone who doubts that Jesus was crucified, except for people who are mythicists, that is, people who deny that Jesus existed at all. If you think that Jesus existed, I think number one would be that this individual got himself crucified for whatever reason. So, since I'm not a mythicist, I would simply say that everything we have, all the evidence points in one way that this person was crucified. I don't think anybody made this up. So I would say this is bedrock or foundational for anything else you want to do as an historian. So unless you doubt Jesus existed at all, this is not something to spend much time on.
Right, and I noticed in your work and speech that you really value worldview because many things depend on that. You said once that Bart Ehrman is the best critique of Jesus as a resurrection, and Mike Licona is best defense, maybe. So maybe both are good, but it depends on worldview. Can you say something more?
A lot depends on the worldview. So, for example, Bart Ehrman doesn't think that miracles can happen. And if you don't think miracles can happen, then that will dictate how you understand or approach the evidence in the New Testament. Mike Licona thinks that there is a God, thinks that this is the Christian God, believes that the Christian God has done and can do miracles, and therefore is open to such a thing. I also have a worldview which allows for the possibility of divine intervention. It also allows for the possibility of all sorts of very strange and weird things. So, in my book on the resurrection, I have looked at, among other things, the claimed apparitions of Mary at Zaytun in Egypt in the 1960s. And I don't dismiss this. I don't know what happened, but I think something truly remarkable happened. So I have a worldview which is open to marvelous things and unexplained things and doesn't need always to have an answer. So I don't know what happened at Zaytun, except that nobody has given me a good rationalistic, reductionistic, materialistic explanation of what it was.
Okay, awesome. Now let's shift from crucifixion to burial. Do you consider it historically likely that Jesus was properly buried in a tomb? And what evidence would you provide to support your claim?
So here I'm also going to sound conservative. There are scholars, for example, you mentioned Bart Ehrman, also John Dominic Crossan, who have argued that Jesus wasn't buried. And their main argument is that most Roman crucifixion victims were either left up on the cross or they were just thrown in a pile for carrion for dogs and other animals to eat. And it's true that that was the most common end of people who were crucified. But I think that the evidence in this case shows us something else. So first of all, our earliest source is Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. and he refers to Jesus being buried. And almost everybody agrees that this is a pre-Pauline confession or formulation of some sort. So Paul's not inventing this idea that Jesus was buried. And the word there that gets translated into English as buried doesn't mean thrown on a pile or left up to be eaten by scavengers. It means some sort of entombment in the ground. So our earliest source says this. Secondly, our Gospels, all four of them, agree on this. I'm also one of those who thinks it's unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely that early Christians invented the story that one of the Jewish leaders, member presumably of the Sanhedrin, had a hand in burying Jesus. I don't think that's something that they would have just made up from scratch. We also know from Josephus that uh, that in the first century, Romans, when it wasn't a time of war, would allow Jews to bury crucifixion victims. He says that explicitly. So that Jewish testimony fits with what I find in the New Testament. And then two more things. One is that we actually do have an ossuary, that is bone box from the first century, that had the bones of a crucifixion victim in it. And that's all the proof we need that sometimes people who were crucified before AD 70, sometimes people who were crucified during the Roman period, were in fact buried. I mean, we have archaeological proof. So I think that that everything I've shared with you makes for a really strong case and overturns the presumption or the generalization that usually people crucified by the Romans were thrown on a pile or left up on a cross. The other thing I would say is this. All of the Gospels agree that when Jesus went from Galilee to Jerusalem for the last time, there were some women with him. And I think it's likely that there were some women who watched him die, who saw him being crucified. And the Gospels, of course, agree on that. And this was a public execution. The crucifixion was not something done in a corner. The Romans always wanted crucifixion to be in public because they wanted to discourage people who had acted like the criminal. So they put these things up in front of city walls or at crossroads, and the meaning is don't do what this person did. So it's a public event. I assume that some of Jesus's followers would have been there. The Gospels say that there were some women there. I find that totally plausible. And if there were some women there, I'm sure they would have been interested in where he was uh, buried or interred. And I think that they also, because they were just human beings, and this is totally normal, and this is Jewish custom, as soon as they could, they would go to the place of burial to mourn. That's what people in all times and places have done. So I would say that the little tidbits we have about the women actually make historical sense to me. And when I add that to everything else, I'm pretty confident of this. Now, there are, of course, other scholars who have a different view, but this is one where I think the evidence is clearly on one side.
Great, thank you so much. And would you use argument about Joseph of Arimathea? Is that some argument for burial story?
Well, so I just think it unlikely that early or implausible, maybe that's the better way to say this. I think it implausible that if Christians were inventing a story, they would have decided that it was Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, presumably the Sanhedrin, who did this. The Christians didn't have any friendly ideas about the Sanhedrin, about the Jewish leaders. They thought of them as Jesus's opponents. I think they could have had other people bury Jesus if they were just making something up. John could have had Lazarus of Bethany bury him, or Simon the leper, who's in the Gospel of Mark. He could have done this. They could come up with other names if they were just inventing something. So I think this is unlikely. However, I will note that nobody really knows where Arimathea uh, was. It must have been a very tiny place. So people who are skeptical will say, well, they just made up the name. I don't know how to prove that wrong, but I think the stronger argument is it's unlikely that Christians invented this person. Although it is the case that Christian legend really likes Joseph of Arimathea. He ends up, I don't know if you know this, founding the Church of England and taking the cup from the Last Supper and doing all sorts of things in Christian tradition. So once he's there, uh, he gets um, he gets turned into things that he most assuredly was not. But I think that the beginning of this legendary process is probably a memory that this guy did this. Uh, More than that, we don't know much. Can't say a lot.
Yeah, did I correctly understood that maybe disciples or whoever write this story, if they want to lie or something like that, they would say, "Oh yeah, this guy is from Jerusalem, Galilee, or something." They wouldn't say Arimathea, that's a little and unknown place. Yeah.
Well, okay, so I understand that as an argument. You could take the other side that if they're making something up, they're going to make up a place because people might say, hey, I've never heard of Joseph of Jerusalem. And if you say Joseph of Arimathea, you could say, I've never heard of him either, but I've never heard of Arimathea. So you can make that one work both ways. But at the end of the day, I'm conservative on this one. I think it's likely that this story in all four Gospels has an historical memory behind it.
Great, thank you. And now, after burial, did the disciples find the tomb empty on Sunday?
Well, so I guess I would say again, I tend to be conservative on this. I don't think the story about Mary Magdalene seeing Jesus, which is in both Matthew and John, I don't think it was made up. I also don't think that the story of some women finding the empty tomb was made up. So I would have to say that this story of an empty tomb is early. There's also a 3-day motif, which is in the Gospels and also in 1 Corinthians 15. And I'm guessing that whatever Jesus may himself may have said, or however he may have used that expression, it was close enough to what happened that they could use it. And 3 days means a short period of time. So the way I've put this in my own work is that I think within a week of Jesus's death, people were already trying to put things together and figure out what this might mean, that the tomb is empty, and that some people have seen him or reported seeing him, and so on. But I do think that there's a period of time here. There has to be a time for reflection and putting things together. The other thing is that the disciples are disciples of a teacher, and this teacher taught certain things, and they had certain expectations from him. And they're going to try, I think, to put three things together. So my own view is that we have some post-mortem encounters or visions, however you want to understand them, people saying, I saw Jesus. Then you have this story of an empty tomb, but then you also have expectations from the pre-Easter period. You might remember that Luke 19 says the disciples expected the kingdom of God to appear immediately. Do you remember that? Or Acts 1, the disciples are saying, is it now the time that everything's going to end? So they've got these ideas about the end in their head. They've got some ideas about resurrection already, and they're trying to put together what Jesus thought and what they expected with this tomb story, and then these firsthand accounts of, I saw Jesus. So I think it's putting these three things together, which is going to take a little while. I don't know, a few days, few weeks, uh, that before you get something like a public proclamation of the resurrection and people convinced that they've got a message and they've got it figured out well enough that they can start talking to other people about it. So I think it starts early, but again, there's going to be a period of development where everybody tries to figure things out. And I suppose I should add a fourth element. So if you have a tomb, if you have expectations, pre-Easter expectations, if you have some encounters with the postmortem Jesus, you're also going to have these people thinking about biblical texts. You're going to have them thinking about scriptural texts, and they're going to wonder, what does the Old Testament, what does the Hebrew Bible have to say about this? Can we connect this stuff, with that? If you look at 1 Corinthians 15, the death and burial are according to the scriptures, right? They're according to the scriptures. So they're also trying to fit what has happened into their knowledge of scripture.
Amazing. And would you think that many scholars or most scholars would agree with you that tomb was empty, and historians and other experts in the field?
Okay, so I don't know how to answer questions like that because it's an understandable question, but I don't know how to count and I don't know who counts. So, look, if you have a worldview that says there can be no miracles, then you're probably going to be prejudiced against the story of the empty tomb. On the other hand, if you're a Christian or if you're an apologist, you're going to want to find the tomb empty, right? So it's really hard to find people who aren't being driven by a ideological program, who aren't, it's hard to find people who know what they think, who don't know what they think before they look at all the evidence. So it really is the case that most of the time we're looking for things and then we sort of move the evidence around so that it supports what we want it to. That's just because we're human beings. So I've actually never known how you count heads in a debate like this, but I also myself wouldn't be interested in a head count because what I would care about, the only thing I care about, is arguments. So I don't care if arguments come from apologists or they come from skeptics. All I care about is the argument itself, right? So I'm one of, some people like to refer to the consensus. I'm one of those who's allergic. I never use the word consensus. I don't like it and I don't care because the consensus, among other things, the consensus 100 years ago isn't what it is now and is going to be different in 100 years. Things change, times change. There are trends in the field. So I don't care where the argument comes from. I just want to look at the argument. And then how you count, I don't know. What's usually happening, though, is that people who say, well, the consensus says, they usually use that as a sort of appeal to wait for what they hold. And I guess that makes some sort of sense. I'm not the only one to say this. There are other rational people who agree with me. But I also sometimes think this is just lazy. Instead of arguing for something, you just say it's the consensus or it's what everyone thinks or most people believe. I don't like that. So to keep repeating, I just care about arguments.
Good point. I agree totally. uh, okay. Did the apostles believe that they saw Jesus after the crucifixion? Also, can you list who specifically is most likely to have experienced some form of appearance, vision, or similar event?
Okay, so here, I think we're just stuck with what the New Testament says. So I think that the story of Mary Magdalene seeing Jesus um, goes back to a memory. So I would say Mary Magdalene, and I would say Mary Magdalene first of all. Mary Magdalene first of all. And by the way, if Mary Magdalene is at the tomb, she's the first one to think empty tomb, encounter with Jesus, and she also followed Jesus around, so she knows what he taught. So I think Mary may be the first person to put all this together and to think, oh, we got something new here. We have a resurrected individual. So that's the first thing. Secondly, there's the reference to Peter in 1 Corinthians 15. And the problem is that we don't know much about it because there's no story in the Gospels that is exactly an appearance to Peter. Now, some people think that maybe John 21, you remember that, where the disciples are in a boat on the Sea of Galilee and Peter gets out, maybe somehow that's related to the first appearance. But the truth is, the sad truth is that we don't know. So I am sure that Peter thought he saw Jesus, but I can't tell you anything about this. And I've even had the thought that maybe Peter saw Jesus and Jesus didn't say anything. It's possible. And that's why we don't have a story, because there was nothing to say beyond, I saw Jesus. I have no idea. We can only speculate. Uh, Maybe Mark didn't end at 16:8. Maybe there was a longer ending and it's been lost, and maybe Jesus appeared to Peter then. So, yes, Jesus appeared to Peter, but I want to be really cautious because I'm not sure what form this took or how it worked. Okay. Then there's no doubt that Paul thought he had an encounter with Jesus. I'm also one, some of my colleagues disagree with me, other New Testament scholars, but I don't think that the accounts in Acts, there are three accounts of the Damascus Road experience in Acts. I don't think they're simply legends. I think there are correlations between those and things Paul says. I think that they go back to Paul's own accounting of his story. Uh, they've been things have been done to them editorially and so on. But I do think that Paul was certain that he had seen Jesus, had some sort of encounter with him. So those three people, I would start with them. But then I would have to say that Christian apologists are sometimes careless here because we actually don't know much about most of the other disciples. If you ask, what do you know about Bartholomew or Thaddeus? The answer is there is no answer. Nobody knows. There's also the fact that there's a motif of doubt in multiple sources. For example, in Matthew 28, Jesus appears to the 12 or the 11, and then it says, but some doubted. That's not elaborated on. Who are these people who are doubting? How long did they doubt? Was their doubt resolved? Were they always of two minds? Now, it's nice in the Gospel of John because when you have doubting Thomas, the doubt is resolved. But there's no resolution in Matthew. It just says some doubted, and you wonder, what's behind that? I doubt that this motif of doubt was invented or created out of nothing. It's in multiple sources. You also have in Luke people who are incredulous when they first hear about the empty tomb. So I am sure that there is doubt. Uh, I don't know what form it took or how it was resolved and so on. The other thing is, I don't know about the long history of these folks. Maybe we'll come back to that. I think you'll have a question about these people and how they died. But um, the truth is that concerning the majority of the disciples, I personally don't think we know anything about what happened to them in the long run. Maybe a couple of them just, decided they didn't want to be in the religious business anymore and went back to Galilee and took up farming or fishing or whatever they were doing. If that had happened, I don't think we'd know about it. So, uh, what I'm saying here is Mary, Peter, Paul. There's also there's also really good attestation for some sort of collective appearance to the 12. Uh, and we have a version of this in John. We have a version of it in Luke. I think we have another version in Matthew. I think this memory has taken several different forms. But although I will say that there was a collective appearance, it's it's just true that we don't have independent interviews with these people one on one. What did they see? Did they see different things? Did they have disagreements about what they saw? Was there one person there who said, "I'm not sure I saw that," and then they got persuaded by everybody else? The point is that when these sorts of things happen in the modern world, it's great when we have psychologists or social scientists who can go and interview people. What did you see? And so on and so on. We don't have this. So, one of the problems for us Christians is that at points where we would like to know more, the sources are really, we have to admit, fairly thin. So, that's a long, rambling answer, or my attempt at an answer to your question.
All right, well, let me jump with some questions about your answer. Because what are sources for Mary? Because she's not even eyewitness. Is it problem when you don't have a eyewitness account? When, for example, Paul talk about many other people, and it's still one account. So is that problem or not for you?
Well, so yeah, again, I'm sort of conservative here. So I think that the tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, where it agrees with the Gospels, uh, is a good place to start and to ask historical questions. Now, I'm not sure what you mean by we don't have, you're right, we don't have Mary's own account, right? We just have later accounts, which is why I'm often careful with how I formulate things. I don't know if you've noticed, but sometimes instead of saying this story is historical, I'll say something like, I think it has evolved out of memory, or that there is memory in it. So I think there is memory in these two different accounts of Jesus meeting Mary Magdalene. But you're right, we don't have her own testimony. But that's the problem of the Gospels in general. We have nothing written from Jesus, right? We have no firsthand, "Hi, I'm Jesus. I'm writing this book. This is what I really said, and this is what I really did." We don't have that. So we have the problem of eyewitness and testimony and memory. It runs throughout all of our investigations. It's just the way it is with ancient sources.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. And what about Mark 16? Because it seems like it ends without explaining appearances of Jesus, or uh, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I I if you were to ask me to bet, did Mark's gospel end at 16:8, or did it originally go beyond 16:8? I don't know what I would say, okay? Because for me, this is a very close call. I think 16:8 is an odd ending. It doesn't satisfy me. But there are many scholars who think it did, and that Mark wanted to end at 16:8. We do have some additional endings. I'm sure that none of them are original. But I think it's possible that Mark went on and related something like what you have in John 21, or Mark went on and related an appearance to Peter. Again, this is the frustration of history. We don't know. And if Mark ended there, why did he end there? And what more did he know? What more did his audience know? Um, we have arguments for all these things. And I personally think that there is some reason for thinking that the story in John 21 about the disciples in the boat and fishing and Jesus showing up, I think that would fit Mark very nicely. But I can't prove that. I don't know how to show it. It's just a sort of suspicion that maybe Mark originally ended like this. But I don't know. And I'm not even sure that the gospel went beyond 16:8. I have colleagues that are pretty confident it ended at 16:8. I have other colleagues who are sure that it went beyond that. I just have a real problem figuring this out. So I can't help anybody when it comes to the ending of Mark.
Yes, that's honest. I agree again. And maybe that longer edition of Mark 16, even if that's not original one, can we say there is some historical kernel or something that's
Well,
historical.
yeah. So the longer ending has the motif of doubt. It has a sort of missionary impulse in it. You know, you should go and preach, evangelize. Uh, it has a little list of Jesus appearing to more than one individual. So yes, but I think it's likely that the memories there are mediated through the other gospels. That is, if I had to bet, I would say it's likely that whoever wrote the longer ending had heard one or more of the gospels that we have and is sort of putting together what the author has heard in the other text. So look, I hate to be frustrating, but uh, we have to be honest when the evidence is inconclusive, right? And all we can do usually is make bets. So the way I think of it usually is we're always operating on a spectrum. So over here we have certainty or moral certainty. We really know. And down here it's no way. This could not have happened. This is so improbable as to be, we pay no attention to it. But the problem is most of the things are in the middle. And for me, lots of things are right in the middle, sort of in the 50-50 area where it could go either way. And Mark's conclusion is one of those uh, places where I just don't know which way I should go. Likely it ended there, likely it didn't end there. I don't know. I think it's more likely than not that the longer ending has been influenced by the canonical gospels that we have. But I could be wrong. I wouldn't wager much on that, and I wouldn't be dogmatic about it.
All right. And what about Thomas? You mentioned him, and how likely is that's historical description
So
in John?
so when it comes to Thomas, I actually follow the analysis of a famous British scholar, C.H. Dodd, who was a major biblical scholar in the 20th century and was one of the world's great experts on the Gospel of John, and somebody still worth reading. So what Dodd thought is that the story of Thomas is an artistic development by the evangelist of the motif of doubt in the tradition. So John knows the tradition that there was doubt, and then he makes it into a story personified in Thomas as his way of dealing with it. So the story of Thomas actually doesn't work by itself as an independent story. It looked to Dodd like it was developed out of the appearance to the 12, and he thought it was a way of expanding upon the motif of doubt. And this is one of the reasons, again, why I will say things like, I think it contains memory or preserves memory, rather than giving the impression that it's a sort of photographic picture that's accurate down to its details. So that's how I deal with that story.
Thank you, Dr. Allison. And let's talk more about 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. Is it a reliable account? Did more than 500 people actually see Jesus at one time after his death?
Okay, so first of all, I'm assuming that 500 is a round number. I'm assuming that nobody was there counting, and it came out to exactly 500. So what it means is a big crowd, right? Maybe it means a few hundred. I'm not sure. It means a big crowd. So I would say that given what Paul reports, that it's likely that a crowd of people or many people within a crowd said that they saw Jesus. The problem that I have here, and this is where some of the people who've been on your program would disagree with me. This is where some apologists would disagree with me. They would say this is highly evidential. And what I would say is, I don't know anything about this event. I don't know who these people were. I do not know when this happened. I don't know if this is pre or post Pentecost. I guess post Pentecost, but I don't know. I don't know how Jesus appeared. How did Jesus appear? Was he in the clouds? Uh, did he have a receiving line? Was he shaking people's hands on the ground? Was he standing on the top of the mountain so people near him could see him and the people in the distance, it looks like Jesus. Is that Jesus? Oh, yeah, I guess it's Jesus. That sounds kind of silly. But if you really push this, then how much do you know? So this, if I were there, see, here's where I'm wishy-washy. If if I were there, I might discover that this was truly an astounding, inexplicable event, and I might say Jesus appeared to these people. But it's also possible. I've known Christians who thought they saw Jesus in a cloud formation. I remember people passing around pictures of Jesus in a cloud formation, saying, "Yeah, Jesus appeared." I don't think that happened, but you have to be honest. So there are Roman Catholics who will say Jesus appeared to, thousands of people in Portugal at Fatima in 1918, and they will say thousands can't be lying. But the fact that they can say that doesn't exclude investigation. This is a really interesting phenomenon, whatever it was. But the fact that someone says thousands saw Mary or thousands saw the sun dance is just the beginning of investigation. Or I think even more interesting than Fatima is the series of appearances at Zaytun in Egypt in the 60s and early 70s. The testimony to this is overwhelming. It's incredible. It's really strange, right? Uh, and if you talk to, let's say, Coptic Egyptian Christians, they will say, thousands of people saw Mary at Zaytun. Okay. Then, as somebody who's not a Coptic Christian, you're going to have to investigate. You're going to have to listen to the testimonies. You're going to have to examine the photographs. You're going to have to look at the journalistic accounts and so on. My problem with the 500 is I don't have any of that. I just have a claim. And so Paul thinks it's evidential, and Paul may have known some of these people, but I don't I don't know them, and I don't know that the Corinthians knew them. I've often wondered if the Corinthians knew any of these people, wouldn't Paul have said something like, "Oh, and by the way, these three people that you know were among them," but he doesn't. He just says the 500. So again, my apologetical friends don't like me here. I'm not a skeptic insofar as I think something happened. Uh, and I'm not a skeptic because I think something remarkable could have happened. But as an historian, I don't know how to show this at all. As an historian, let's say, trying to argue with a skeptic, I don't think this is how you get to uh, this is not how you persuade somebody Jesus rose from the dead, by appealing to the 500.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, maybe this is tough, really. So, yeah, okay, I appreciate it. So, would you connect this appearance to 500 people with maybe Matthew 28 because Craig or someone else would connect those stories?
Yeah, so that occurs occasionally down through the centuries in the commentaries. Uh, so again, I have to say, possible, but I don't know how you would show it. I personally think it's unlikely. If I had to guess, okay, think of it this way. Why are 500 people together in the first place? What are they? Are they on a picnic? What are they doing? I'm guessing that this is post Easter. This is probably post Pentecost, and there is a crowd of people, and they are gathered for some religious purpose. I don't know why you'd have 500 people together before Pentecost. I don't know what that would be about. So I think this is probably a post Pentecostal event. And it might have been as amazing as Zaytun, whatever that was, but I just don't know how to fill out the details. But again, isn't it an interesting question? Why are there 500 people together in one place? You know, has somebody told them to expect something? Are they gathered for a reason? Did they just sort of were they milling around? There has to be a reason. And again, I don't know what the reason was. So, you know, again, when you look at modern accounts or modern extraordinary claims, you always want to interview and see film and talk to, you know, the skeptics who are on the scene. You want to do as much as possible to figure out what happened. And we just don't have those sorts of materials for this. So, one of my favorite quotations comes from an early third century theologian, Origen of Alexandria. He's one of my favorite Christians, one of my favorite thinkers. And Origen at one point says what I think should be obvious, but for some reason it isn't. He says one of the most difficult things to do is to show that something happened, even if it did. It's really difficult to show that something happened, even if it did. So this sort of goes against the mindset of lots of apologists or mindset of skeptics, because the skeptics think they can always disprove, or they're always setting out to disprove something, and the apologists are always setting out to prove prove this or that. And I'm kind of in the middle with I don't think either one of you, you know, is always, you know, on target here. Your arguments sometimes cancel each other out. I think lots and lots and lots of things simply can't be established through traditional historical critical means, whether wielded by apologists or by skeptics.
Yeah, maybe we all have some situations when some of our trusted friends say something that happened, and we cannot prove that, but we can believe him. So, can you say that maybe it's case that we have something like that in maybe New Testament about those
Oh,
events?
okay. Well, so that goes back to the worldview question. So that depends
Yeah.
on let's say you're a Christian of a particular sort, and within that worldview, the sort of thing that you're saying here and getting at could be developed into an argument. Yes, I do understand that, but that is not a historical argument. A historical argument, as I conceive of it, is a public argument for which you can give reasons that almost everybody could evaluate fairly. That is, uh, they don't depend on your particular worldview, right? So, uh, worldview is a big problem here for this topic, certainly, at the end of the day.
Yes. Okay. Do you agree that 1 Corinthians 15:3-8 is a part of an early creed, an oral Christian tradition?
Yes, so I think that's pretty clear. So first of all, Paul says, you know, that he's passing this on, and he's using Greek words that have an equivalent with the rabbi, have equivalents with the rabbis. They're receiving and passing on tradition, but it's a formal creed. By the way, if you look at, let's say, the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or lots of early Christian creeds, they have these formal structures. And this has a formal structure. It also has certain words and expressions that Paul doesn't use elsewhere. So you put all that together. Yeah, this is a pre-Pauline creed. Now, I think that the elements of it, like he appeared to Peter, he appeared to the 12, he was buried. Uh, I think the elements go back to the beginning of the church, but I cannot tell you who actually took those elements or those beliefs and formalized them, made them into a formula. I can't tell you when. It could have been Jerusalem in AD 34, but it could have been Antioch in AD 41. I just don't know how we get to that. Also, there's another frustrating issue here. There has been a debate as to whether this Greek looks like translation Greek, whether this is a translation of a Semitic original, whether it could be a Hebrew or Aramaic creed. And there was a debate on this that was lively at one time, and the upshot was inconclusive unfortunately. So it's possible that Paul has a tradition which is actually a translation of some very early primitive uh, texts, but I don't know how to show that. All I can tell you is that it's pre-Pauline and that its ingredients go back to the beginning. But when those ingredients were put together, I can't tell you or who did that.
Yeah, fair. And can you give some other examples of early oral traditions or hymns that we find in the New Testament like
Well,
this?
so I'm one who thinks again, you need to know that there are people who disagree with me and they have good reasons for disagreeing with me. But I think the hymn in Philippians 2, or let's the formal piece in Philippians 2, where Christ does not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but empties himself, right? And then receives the name that is above every other name. I think that is pre-Pauline. And I think that was likely Aramaic originally. I think that there is some reason to think that. There's also a piece in the first chapter of Colossians, which, about Christ as the visible image, the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. That, which has really interesting parallels with John 1, uh, also, I think, is probably some sort of, well, we have a problem here because we're not really sure what hymns were, right, back then. And it doesn't look like a Greek hymn. So what kind of hymn would it be? Would it be a confession instead of a hymn? How does this work? How's it transmitted? These are open questions. But I personally think that Paul's letters are full of formulations that are pre-Pauline. So when he says Maranatha at the end of Corinthians, he's not inventing this. This is an Aramaic liturgical expression that he's taken over. Lord come. That goes back. There's already some primitive liturgy there. When Paul recites the words of the Last Supper, he's passing on tradition. Uh, there are lots of places in Paul where he is, in my judgment, passing on things. When he uses the formula that God sent the Son, this sending language, I think he's getting this sending language from the tradition. So my own view is that while Paul's very creative, many, many, many of his ingredients are from the Christian tradition. And as an historian, what maybe frustrates me more than anything is that I would like to know more about what's between Jesus and Paul, what's between Jesus. All we have is the book of Acts, and it doesn't even give you one chapter per year. I mean, what on earth is going on during these years? People are thinking, people are being creative, people are developing theology, they're developing Christology, and we don't really have any sort of real history of these theological developments. We just have the Gospels in Paul, and then Acts. Even if Acts is 100% pure history, you're just getting little snippets of things. You're not getting the whole story. How can you tell the whole story? Uh, Acts covers more than 30 years in less than 30 chapters. So our ignorance is large.
Okay, one day in heaven we will have a tough discussion with Paul. He needs to give us some answers. So that's rude. He didn't give us his vision. Okay, you mentioned Philippians 2, and some argue, I forgot argument, sorry, but I believe you know that there is some addition that maybe Christians add, who being in the form of God thought it not a robbery to be equal with God. So they say that's addition, or do you believe in that? Or
I'm not sure what you're saying by addition. Do I mean I think it's pre-Pauline. I don't think Paul is creating that language. I also don't think it's been added by a later editor. I think that's originally in Philippians, and I think that it is pre-Pauline. I think it predates uh, the apostle and the writing of Philippians. But again,
Yeah,
I
some
couldn't tell you,
suggest. Yeah,
I couldn't tell
sorry.
you who composed it or when or where exactly, right?
Yep. Some scholars say that there is a parallelism between some verses in Philippians 2, and one is alone, don't have parallelism. So maybe that's addition. Yeah, that's argument. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, okay. Well, I just at this point I have not been convinced by attempts to deconstruct uh, the paragraph or whatever you want to call it, the hymn. Uh, I think my guess is, my best guess is that it is mostly or entirely Pauline.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, do you agree that apostles undergo some transformation due to their belief in Jesus' resurrection, from discouraged and fearful to bold and willing to confirm their faith through their death?
Okay, so here we have an issue. I think that argument works for Peter. I think it works for James, the son of Zebedee. I think it works for John, the son of Zebedee, uh, because we have some evidence that these were Christian people up to the end of their lives, and that two of them at least were martyred. So James of Zebedee and Peter. I'm not sure whether Peter was crucified or whether he was burned, but he was almost certainly executed under Nero. But here's the problem. Christian tradition has lots and lots of stories about the martyrdoms of all 12 apostles. But if you read the New Testament, or if you read literature from the first century, you don't find these stories. You have to go to second and third and fourth century literature to find the stories of their martyrdom. So I have no trouble with thinking that the crucifixion was disturbing and depressing and demoralizing, and that later on, this group was able to overcome those things. But I don't know, again, what happened to Bartholomew. I don't know that he was martyred. Um, One of the things that Christian apologists haven't, to my knowledge, noted is that in Acts 1, Jesus says to the 12, you will be witnesses. That's how it comes out in the English translations. You will be witnesses for me in all the world. But the Greek word is martores. The Greek word is literally, you will be martyrs. And we know that later Christians read this as referring to martyrdom. So here's the thing. If you think Jesus told the 12, you will be martyrs, then if you have enough history, you're going to have stories of the martyrdoms of all these people. And for some of them, like Matthew, you have more than one story of martyrdom, right? So I don't have any trouble saying that Peter was martyred and he must have been sincere for his faith. The same thing with James of Zebedee. But I don't know how to move this to all the apostles. That is, all you have to do is name some of them, from the second half of the lists of the 12. And what do we know about them? All we have are later legends. So if you want to make an argument from the sincerity of the apostles, I think you need to make that a constricted argument. Paul was clearly sincere and thought he saw Jesus. Peter was sincere and thought he saw Jesus. You can do this for a handful, but you can't really do it for all of them, because if you're being a serious historian, you just have to say, I don't have any evidence until later legends. So again, sorry to disappoint. This is an argument that works, gets you a little ways, but you can't do it for all 12 of them.
Yeah, maybe not about that, but maybe we can see in some texts that apostles were really scared before appearances, and later they were courage, not maybe ready to die, but just yeah, transformed in some
Oh,
way.
well, sure. John gives you that picture. You put John together with Acts, but it just makes sense. If your teacher, your leader has been crucified, you're going to wonder what else they're going to do. Are they going to come after me? So the picture that John has sounds to me like it would fit what happened. That is, they were worried and they were afraid. Maybe they were hiding out for a bit. Uh, maybe they wanted to get lost in a crowd at some point. Uh, and then early Christianity was a missionary religion to begin with, and they are proselytizing people. So there are obviously members of this group uh, which leave their hiding or quit being less than public people, and they're out in public doing this. So yeah, that shows sincerity. It shows conviction. Uh, if you want to go further than that, that's fine. I'm not sure I want to go further than that. Just that they obviously they had convictions.
Yes, and what about John? Because some traditions they are that he was boiled in some oil or drink or some poison or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
So yeah.
So yeah, there are stories about John's martyrdom. I've argued that none of them that we don't have any reason to think of them as historical. I think that John probably lived out to his old age. That's really complicated question. It has to do with who the John of Revelation is. It has to do with the beloved disciple and the authorship of the fourth gospel, and that becomes really, really complicated. All I'll say is that there is a tradition that both sons of Zebedee were martyred, that some New Testament scholars think is historical. I don't myself think it is uh, historical, so I have doubts. So I am sure, I'm confident that one Zebedee was a martyr. I can't tell you that the other one was.
Great, thank you so much. And now we talk about this question a little, but can you say something more? Was Paul a persecutor of early Christians and later, due to, as he perceived it, an encounter with the risen Jesus, became a prominent Christian missionary? So some argue that Paul wasn't even a persecutor. That's maybe added later.
Okay, so I'll be candid and just say I don't know who the folks are who are arguing that Paul was not a persecutor of Christians. He's explicit about this. Uh, if you read Galatians, it just seems it's there. I don't know how to get around it. So uh, Paul talks a little autobiographically in Philippians and Galatians especially, and uh, there was debate as to exactly what form this persecution took and what authority he had and so on. But that he was a persecutor in some way, I don't know how you get around his own words. And also, he at some point comes to regret this or feel guilt about it, however you want to formulate that. That's also obvious. Uh, and then he clearly has a change of personality. Now, you may want to push that and say only an encounter with the risen Jesus would do that. I'm not enough of a psychologist uh, to be able to tell you what's required for changing your life upside down and going from one thing to the other. Maybe a skeptic would say, well, a hallucination could do this too. If you thought you saw Jesus, if you really thought you saw Jesus, even though you were hallucinating, that might work the same trick. So again, I'm going to agree with what you said there, but I'm not sure that it has as much apologetical payoff as some people think.
Right, and what about James? He's similar in some way because he was also a skeptic in some way. At least some apologetics say so. Do you agree with that?
So You're going to get tired of hearing me say this, but we don't know enough. So what we have is we have this story uh, in Mark 3, where it looks like Jesus's family, thinks he's lost his mind and they want to take him home. And then we have the scene in John, the crucifixion scene, John 19, where uh, Jesus gives his mother to John, the son of Zebedee. And the argument is, well, if Jesus's own brothers had been his supporters, he wouldn't have had to do that. So, okay, I understand the argument, but here's what happens. People model what happened to James on to what happened to Paul. And I don't know what the evidence for that is. So we have no account of what happened to James. We have no account in the Gospels or anywhere as to his appearance. We just have Jesus appeared to James. And then we have a story that Jerome preserves. So it's a very late story, and nobody, to my mind, thinks that it is historical. So the issue then becomes, when did James convert? And was his vision coincidental with his conversion? So Mary, the mother of Jesus, according to Acts, is there from an early time, and she doesn't have a resurrection vision. So most people who became followers of Jesus didn't have a resurrection vision. So how do we know? Just asking, how do we know that James didn't see Jesus after he had become persuaded that this cause was the right one and so on? So everyone just assumes that James is like Paul, but I don't know that James was like Paul. Again, James could have converted 6 months after Pentecost and then seen Jesus the next year. How would we know? Right? So I understand what people do with Paul and try to get the most apologetical force out of that. But I'm really skeptical when it comes to James. I don't know when Jesus appeared to James. And I don't know that he was a doubter before then. He might have been, but this falls into the I don't know. And I don't see how everybody else knows. I keep reading that, James didn't believe and then Jesus appeared to him and then he became a believer. But they can't show me the text for this. All they can say is that Jesus' family was not on board fully at a certain time. But then when does Jesus appear to James? And what's happened to him in the meantime? And I have no idea, and nobody else has any idea. You just have to own your ignorance sometimes. So uh, I don't know where you are if you know who Sherlock Holmes is, but he's our great classical British detective, and he always solves the crime. He always figures things out. And we read detective novels. I read detective novels. The detective always figures it out. And so New Testament scholars and apologists have this detective complex, and we think that we can always figure things out. But sometimes we can't. Sometimes we don't have enough evidence to put everything together. So when it comes to James, maybe he converted when Jesus appeared to him. But I don't see how to go beyond maybe.
You're absolutely right. Detective complex. Absolutely. Yeah. Even myself, I admit so. Yeah, I agree. And what about Gospel of Hebrews? Because it says that James never actually was skeptic. He was waiting that he resurrects from dead and he will not eat even bread or something.
Oh, yeah.
So he was considered the James, the just, perfect one or something. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the passage you're referring to is quoted by Jerome, and it doesn't exist anywhere before Jerome. And my best guess is that the Gospel of Hebrews is some sort of adaptation of the Gospel of Matthew, some sort of expansion or editing of the Gospel of Matthew. And it's probably a second century text. And the story that you just referred to, again, I don't know anyone. I don't know anyone. Now, I don't know everybody. I haven't read everything, but I don't recall ever running across an argument for the historicity of that story. This is a story that Christians made up probably in the second century, and it gets put into the Gospel of Hebrews. It's a story by people who admire James, and he's their hero, and they want Jesus to appear to him before Peter or before Mary or before anybody else. So it has some sort of ideological purpose, but I don't think it has any memory in it except that there was a memory that Jesus appeared to James. But I think that's all that we can say.
Yes, would you at least see some difference in his life because he was a bit passive, and later he was a church leader of Jerusalem Church. So is there and he was martyred by yeah, Josephus says in AD 62 or something.
Yeah, yeah.
So do you see
So
some
yeah,
difference?
he's a martyr. Yes, but again, okay. So yes, he became what he wasn't before. And the impression that the Gospels leave is that Jesus's family wasn't fully on board and that there's some tension between Jesus and his family. And that probably informs some of these really harsh sayings that you find in the Gospels, like hate father and mother, or Jesus has no trouble calling people away from their families. So yeah, that's there. But and maybe you're right. Maybe he was implacably opposed to Jesus, and then he has a vision, and then everything's changed. But people can also have conversions that last weeks or months or years. They can change their mind slowly on certain things. So I don't know what happened with James. Sure, I have no doubt that he became a Christian leader. That's obvious from Paul and the book of Acts. Uh, but I don't know how, for example, that would prove Jesus rose from the dead. It would just be a statement about the personal theological or psychological development of James.
Yes,
By the way, I
yeah.
should also add that discussions of James frequently involve discussions of the epistle of James, right? The book of James that follows Hebrews in the New Testament. But of course, there's a debate as to whether James really wrote that. And the other thing about that book, which is amazing, is it says almost nothing about Jesus Christ. If you go through it and just explicitly, Jesus is in 1:1, he's in chapter 2, verse 1. Those are the only two places he's mentioned explicitly. And I personally think the text in 2:1 is a bit fishy. So, and I have questions about whether James wrote the book. So all this is to add to the fact that things are always complicated and difficult and not straightforward.
When we talk about this, can you mention your opinion about First Peter? Do you see some connection between authorship of Peter and that book?
Yeah, so I am sure Peter didn't write Second Peter. I'm pretty sure of that. In fact, that was the first this higher critical decision I ever made. I remember in high school reading about this and deciding, yeah, I don't think Peter wrote Second Peter. That was my first sort of critical conclusion, right? Uh, I'll be honest, I've never known what to make of First Peter, and I've never given it the time or study to have an informed opinion. So I can tell you what other people think. Uh, I honestly have no opinion about when this was written or where it comes from or who wrote it. So maybe I shouldn't admit things like that, but I don't want to have opinions about things uh, that I haven't studied thoroughly, and I've never studied First Peter to any great extent.
Yeah, I read in Hermenea commentary on First Peter that
Huh?
even Peter is not author of that book. The consensus is that it is an expression of the Christian tradition of at Rome that was associated with Peter. So at least we have some connection with Peter. So my question is, can we find some connections with the epistle of James to actual James? Maybe.
Oh, so I think that so first of all, you're talking about Ockmeyer's commentary in the Hermeneus series, which is probably
Yeah.
the best we have on First Peter. Uh, yes, I think that whoever is putting together the book of James clearly admires James and is considers himself to be within the Jamesian wing or school of the church. And I also think there must be continuity between the theology of this book and the theology of James. But the disappointing thing is that it's so quiescent, or it says so little explicitly about Jesus Christ. I wish it would say a lot more. That would be more interesting, but it has very little to say. Nonetheless, yes, I think that James is working with memories and an image. The author of James is working with an image of James and traditions about James. Yes.
Okay, what is your opinion about Paul? We didn't mention how he died, just shortly.
So Paul was almost certainly martyred. He was martyred in Rome. Uh, I think it's possible. I think it's possible that Paul's imprisonment in Acts ended in his release, and then he tried to go to Spain or something like that. But I think that unlikely. I think it's likely that the imprisonment in Acts led to his martyrdom. So the evidence for Paul being martyred is not abundant. It's not everywhere. It's not like the crucifixion of Jesus, but I think it's sufficient. Uh, and again, it's around the time of Peter's martyrdom, I think. That is Rome in the 60s of the first century. Um, so yeah, he's a martyr.
Yes. Okay, thanks. And I'm Seventh-day Adventist, so I need to know this question. Why did Christians change the day of worship from Saturday to Sunday? Does this have anything to do with Greek philosophy or an attempt to distance themselves from Jews and some kind of anti-Semitism? Can Christians use this as an argument for the resurrection?
Okay, so my answer is no, I don't think it's a good argument. And I don't think Christians turned Sunday or Saturday into Sunday. Actually, the use of the word Sabbath for Sunday is a later Christian development. I think that what happens is that Jews keep the Sabbath, and Jewish Christians probably kept the Sabbath, and the Gentile Christians ended up with a sort of Sunday morning business. They couldn't take Sabbath off because they were in the Gentile world. You can't do that. You can do it in the Jewish world because the culture allows it. But the Greek and Roman worlds, you got to work on Saturday. So you're going to have your religious service some other time. And if you look at the New Testament, I think it's likely that the references to the Lord's Day at a couple of points are to Sunday. So I think this is going on. But if you read the sources, you'll find that even much later, third and fourth centuries, there are Christians who are keeping the Sabbath or getting together on Sabbath and on Sunday. So I think that the Jewish Christians are keeping the Sabbath for the most part. In the Gentile world, you're getting something else, but it's not because Sunday became Sabbath or they turned the Sabbath into Sunday or something like that. And even if they did, I don't know how that would be an argument for the resurrection. All it would be an argument for is they thought Jesus rose from the dead on Sunday morning, even if it were a good argument, which I don't think it is. But all that shows is that they thought this. It doesn't show that he did. All right. And we don't need that argument anyway, because we can make an argument that the women went to the tomb early on, and uh, that's where all this stuff comes from.
Yeah, maybe like some background information or something that is consistent with that belief rather than arguments. Yeah, maybe that's better way to say. Uh, all right. When did the proclamation of the resurrection begin? Was it immediately a few days after the crucifixion or later?
So, going back to what I said earlier in this interview, I think that it probably took some time to sort things out and to figure out what kind of message that we have. Once you've concluded that Jesus rose from the dead, you've still got to figure out what does that mean? How do we communicate this to people? Should we communicate this to people? Does it exist in a vacuum by itself? Is it related to his death? You have to do all this thinking. And so the book of Acts seems fairly sensible here. That is, you've got this period of weeks between Jesus's crucifixion and Pentecost, right? You've got several weeks. And my guess is that's probably pretty close. That's not a bad idea. It's plausible that they sat around for a few weeks and tried to think things out. You know, we all grow up in churches and everything is obvious to us. But if you can go back to, let's say, the week after the discovery of the empty tomb, you're trying to put things together. And what on earth is your message? Because Jesus doesn't come into Galilee saying in Mark 1, the Son of Man is going to die and rise from the dead. That's not what he's preaching in Galilee. That's not what they've been hearing. That's not what anybody has said. So you got to figure out, how do we preach this? How do we change the message that we had been preaching? So in the Gospels anyway, Jesus sends the disciples out. He tells them, to cast out demons and heal the sick and to preach the kingdom of God. So they have some missionary experience in their past. What's now the message? How do we change it? What do we add? What do we subtract? How do we relate it to Scripture? How do we become convincing? Right? We can't just get up and say things. We have to have arguments. So I think that at least takes several weeks. And I actually think that it's going to take months before you have a real system begun or started. So yeah, Acts makes sense. Maybe at Pentecost you're beginning to have some sort of a public proclamation of what happened. But again, things are going to take time to develop.
Amazing. And I wonder, do you consider a good argument when we look at history or present, when some people claim that they have experience? Maybe many of them are lies or some hallucination or whatever, but maybe there is some good experience with real appearance of Jesus. So
Oh,
do you see
yeah.
that as possible or good argument or yeah?
Uh, so so that's really tough. I think some people have imaginary religious experiences, and I think some people have genuine encounters with transcendent realities. Given my belief, given my worldview, to revert back to that, I have no trouble thinking that people sometimes encounter Jesus or what they think to be Jesus, and that these are real experiences. And I think sometimes they're not just purely projections, they're not just purely um, endogenous or hallucinatory in the derogatory sense. So yeah, I'm open-minded about that, but you always have to be careful because there is also, you have to admit, there's also a lot of nonsense in religion. There's a lot of nonsense in Christianity. There are a lot of people who see things that aren't there and overinterpret things. So it becomes a really, really tricky thing. But yes, I am open-minded about that. It seems to me kind of odd to think Jesus would have appeared to people in the first century, but there's no reason to do so since then. And that's not the testimony of people in the church. So yeah, I'm open-minded about that.
Good. This is last question, and here it goes. What is the strongest argument for the Jesus's resurrection in your opinion? And on the other hand, where is the resurrection theory the weakest?
Okay, so I think that that's relative again to worldview. But if you're asking that from the skeptic's perspective, the skeptic's perspective would be miracles don't happen, dead people don't come back from the dead. This is just a rule, it's a law. We've seen it time and time again. We see it every day. People die. That's the end of them. That's it. Uh, and that's not a bad argument. It's not a bad argument, and it's not insane. It makes sense. From the other side, I would simply say this is a remarkable series of events that I see at the beginning of Christianity. So I don't know of any parallel to people claiming that they have encountered a dead person, both singly and in groups, plus an empty tomb, plus these people who continue to sense that Jesus is around them, plus the story of Paul. I think this is, just objectively, whether you're a Christian or not, this is an amazing series of events in human history. And this series of events is consistent with the resurrection of Jesus, and it's really remarkable. Now, I'm one who thinks that it takes again a worldview to sort of put everything together. So I think the data is consistent. Again, this is where the apologist doesn't like me, and this is where the skeptic doesn't like me. I think the skeptic can come up with a possible scenario that satisfies the skeptic. And I think the apologist can look at the evidence and say, yeah, I think Jesus rose from the dead, and I'm not crazy for thinking this. But I'm back with Origen at the end of the day, proving through public argument that Jesus rose from the dead or proving that he didn't rise from the dead. I don't see how to do that. I think the issues go way beyond history. And even though I'm an historian by profession, even though I'd like history to tell us more, I have to claim modesty and say there are only certain things we can do. We can talk about the probability of this or the improbability of that. But the big claim that at the end of the day, I can prove this or disprove that, I don't buy them. And by the way, these people aren't persuasive. That is, the apologists aren't converting most of the skeptics. Most of the skeptics aren't converting most of the apologists. That must mean something. Maybe the arguments on neither side are actually as forceful as people think.
Nice. I have some friends that have this thinking. They say even if a resurrection happened, that doesn't prove that God raised Jesus from death. That just maybe points to something else, maybe some uh, knowledge that we don't understand or
Yeah,
have, or maybe some magicians, or maybe some aliens, or whatever.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
God didn't
So
do that. That's the last option for them.
yeah, so that is a logical possibility. I also know Buddhists who think that Jesus rose from the dead and they don't become Christians. I know some Hindus who believe Jesus rose from the dead and don't become Hindus. So, to be a broken record, things depend on your worldview. So, I think you can, if you are a certain sort of Buddhist, look at the evidence and make this fit your religion. And if you are a certain sort of Hindu, you can accept a lot of this and make it fit what you otherwise believe. Uh, I happen to be a certain sort of Christian, and so I resolve the data in a certain way, which is different. But that means again that history's not doing everything. It's not like we're all here and here the historians come and we're going to convert everybody because we can prove A, B, and C. It's rather that the historians make some things plausible, some things implausible, and then people are going to interpret this in terms of everything else they believe about the world and God or not God and so on. It's just the frustrating fact. It's part of the human circus. It's just how it works.
All right, any last words, message for audience? Because can we say at the end something objectively? Because I believe in those humble answers, and yeah, but can you say at the end, is there 51% for resurrection or not? Or
Oh, well, I don't know how to do that. I don't know because there's no we don't have God's point of view. We only have our own point of views, and our point of views always come from our world views. Now, I have argued, and I think, I that's why I've written books. I haven't just said, oh gosh, everything is just your worldview, so who cares? And let's go do something else. I've actually made arguments. So I think it is more reasonable to think that Jesus was buried than he was not buried. And I have arguments for that. And I think it's reasonable to think Jesus was crucified and unreasonable to think that he was not crucified, correct? There are things we can talk about, and we've talked about them during this interview. And the problem with this interview is just that, not your problem, but my problem is that we do need humility, and we need to be honest and say when we don't know things. But just because we don't know all things, or just because history doesn't give us the big answers we sometimes want, doesn't mean history doesn't teach us things. History teaches us a lot. History does help us to navigate these areas. So that's what I've tried to do here today. I think that history helps us make more informed decisions, wherever we're coming from or wherever we end up. So I think it's very useful. But no, at the end of the day, I don't know how to say, okay, on a big question, which is theological as much as anything, I believe God raised Jesus from the dead. I personally believe that, but I do not know how uh, to get there apart from things that go beyond history. I just don't know how to do that.
Dr. Dale Allison, thank you for your time and expertise, for sharing it with us today. Thank you everyone for tuning into this episode, and if you enjoyed this discussion, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, give us donations. In the description we have, and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming interviews and topics. We have plenty more fascinating discussions planned, so stay tuned. And as always, thank you for spending your time with us. See you next time on the NT podcast. Goodbye.